So I want to talk about the whole concept of new thing bad and its relation to movies and TV shows as of late. Because there's one thing I've noticed, like I've done a few videos on this in the past, but I've really noticed this more strongly in recent months because there's been a few movies that have come out lately that have been widely embraced by the general public and seen as good movies or TV shows. But it seems that the only people who are saying, no, this is shit, this sucks, this is awful, is basically the alt-right, dissident right, online right, whatever the fuck you want to call it. The most prominent example of this lately is Dune Part 2, because, like, unanimously, it's been a major success according to critics and audiences alike. Like, it has grossed a shitload of money, especially for a movie that is frankly as weird and artsy as it is and slow paced. Like, it's definitely not your typical MCU Transformers Godzilla Kong type blockbuster. I personally thought it was an amazing movie. Visually speaking, in terms of the visual and audio elements, one of the best movies ever. Although too fucking loud at times. But I mean, the audio is good in terms of like the sound effects, they sound good. It's just too fucking loud. Like the music's good. The sound effects are good. It's just too fucking loud. But otherwise, you know what? Great movie. Amazing fucking movie. Visually speaking, one of the best movies ever in terms of cinematography, in terms of just atmosphere. It's just a really well-made film. And you know what? Yes, Zendaya was fucking miscast. I will agree with that. She's not great in that role. They should have got someone more attractive. I don't even think frankly, they could have found a more attractive brown girl. If they're looking for a girl who's like looks brown or whatever, they could have found a much more attractive one than Zendaya. But I mean, honestly, that aside, like I disagree with the premise that it was a bad movie, and I disagree with the premise that like her character overshadowed every other aspect of the movie. But moreover, it's not just about Dune Part 2, it's about movies and TV in general. I'm just noticing a tendency among the right wing to essentially anything new, they completely pick apart all the flaws and they make the flaws basically the basis of their entire opinion of the movie or show. Whereas for older stuff, they tend more to view it much more leniently, even if it possesses the same types of flaws. And another recent example is the new Civil War film. Like, I've seen a lot of the right-wing people say it sucks, but even though this movie has a lot of very strong elements in terms of, like, cinematography, action sequences, atmosphere, etc. Again, like, one thing I would say is I think actually in recent years, there's been a lot of very strong movies in those elements, like visual elements, cinematography, sound, action sequences, atmosphere, things like that. Like the sort of like that aspect of filmmaking. Now, in terms of storytelling, I think movies as of late range from bad to passable to decent. Like I would say in terms of like the greatest movies ever in terms of storytelling, we haven't really had any lately. But I guess maybe it could be to some extent on a personal level. I'm a more visual person than a lot of people are, so I might place more stock into those aspects of filmmaking. But nonetheless, even despite that, like I do think there's a tendency among right-wingers to just really, by default, like knee-jerk reaction, just hate new stuff, especially if it's like big new releases. And also especially if it's from certain franchises, like say for instance Andor. Andor is a fucking great show. It's the first season was amazing. It was actually really intelligent, a lot of good dialogue, and it showed Star Wars from a completely different angle than we've ever seen it before. It was original. It was kind of almost like Game of Thrones in terms of the tone and the pacing and the dialogue, just with less, F words, and less sex, and less graphic violence. But like, okay, my point is like Andor was a good show, but oh no, Disney Star Wars sucks. We can't give Andor a fair hearing. No, we have to just dismiss it as shit. In many cases without even watching it, but even those who have watched it, yeah. I mean, I think there people are being unfair to it. Mandalorian, the first season was pretty good. Second season was eh. It was kind of iffy. I've not seen the third season, but I've heard that it's shit, and I believe it from what I've seen. So again, like, I mean, I still think that, like, a lot of stuff just isn't getting a fair hearing lately. Like, a lot of people are just dismissing it like new thing bad. in these right wing circles. I've seen a bit of that for the Batman also, although maybe not to as much of an extent. But yeah, I'd say those are some of the biggest examples in recent memory of things just being dismissed as like new thing bad. Also, a lot of right wingers, for instance, when I recommend Yellow Jackets, a lot of them refuse to watch it at all because they're like, oh, it's a show with girls in it, therefore it sucks. And I'm like, okay, I'm sorry, but the first season was like one of the best fucking TV seasons I've ever watched. Second season, mixed bag. Like, second season had some strong aspects, but it also fucked up in a lot of ways. But yeah, first season, one of the best seasons of any TV show. I've watched it more times than any single season of any TV series. But again, like a lot of these right wing people, they won't even give it a chance. They're like, oh, it's a show about girls, therefore I don't want to watch it. Therefore it's woke. And it's like, no, the first season wasn't really woke at all. The second season wasn't even overtly woke. It's just that it had problems because it kowtowed to the wokeness of fans by changing Lottie's character. But it wasn't actually overtly woke. It's just that it lacked certain things because people found it unwoke. So yeah, I mean, fair enough. But first season is a pretty fucking good season, you know? It's a really fucking good TV season. So my point is, like, overall, is media in decline lately? Like, yes, I would say overall, like, media was better in the 2010s compared to the previous decade, and perhaps was better in the 2000s compared to the 2010s. Like, it really depends what medium you're talking about, what genre you're talking about. But I'd say overall, yes, there is a decline going on. But does it mean that there's nothing good coming out anymore? No. It just means that, like, these days, I think the default is more to expect that things will probably suck. Like, I was like, oh, there's a new Ghostbusters movie. It'll probably suck. And from what I've heard, it does. I haven't seen it, but from what I've heard, it does. Or like, oh, there's a new Godzilla movie. It'll probably suck. And from what I've heard, it probably does. The new Godzilla Kong movie. I haven't seen it. People are saying good things about this Japanese Godzilla -1. I have not seen that. So I guess that's an exception to new thing bad, because that is getting a lot of rave reviews, even from right-wing types. So yeah, fair enough. But like, I don't know. This brings me to my next part of what I'm saying, which is sometimes we have to look back at the old thing and ask, was it as good as we thought? And I'm not talking about things like visual art or architecture, because those actually were better in previous centuries. But I'm talking more recently, and specifically with like movies, TV, fucking video games, books, and music, for instance. Like, a lot of the movies that people idealize from their childhood or from previous decades weren't that great. And I think people excuse a lot of shitty stuff from back then because they remember it fondly due to nostalgia. Like, for instance, okay, let's look at Back to the Future Part 3. Even as a kid, I found that movie underwhelming. I thought it was a disappointment compared to the previous two. It honestly wasn't that great. Like, I think the problem with Back to the Future Part 3 is that it did what a lot of people wanted probably, I would guess, wanted the franchise to do, which is like, hey, why not take it further back in time to like a historic time period, you know, but prior to the 20th century. So they did that. They took it to the Old West, and it's like, it kind of wasn't that great. And it's like, this is why like Back to the Future worked better when it was set in like either the present day, the 50s, or the 2010s, like either, you know, like a few decades ahead or a few decades back. When they tried taking it too far back in time, it started feeling like some awkward mix of a Back to the Future film, but also a genre film, like a Western in that case. And it just didn't work. And it's like, it probably would have worked even less if they had Doc Brown and Marty go to the Roman Empire or something like that. And I'm glad they didn't do that. That would have probably been even worse. So yeah, Back to the Future Part 3 was not a great movie. It was a disappointing conclusion to the franchise. The only scene I really liked in the entire movie was at the very end when he got back to the present day and he decided not to participate in that drag race and it made his future better. That was like, oh, that was the only moment in the fucking movie that showed character development. Well, I mean, no. Actually, the whole movie was about his character developing toward that point. But I'm like, could we have just had him have that character development like without everything else before it? I don't know. Like, the whole movie fucking sucked. Like, yes, okay, was it worth it for that one good moment of character development at the end that was the culmination of the entire kind of crappy, mediocre movie that came before it. I don't know. It's a bit like, Jesse Pinkman arriving in Alaska at the end of El Camino. It's like, that was a good moment, but the rest of the movie leading up to it was kind of not that great. So, I don't know. Another example of this, okay, a movie from previous eras that people idealize too much, Return of the Jedi. It honestly wasn't that great. And even Red Letter Media acknowledged it. They said that this was the movie where Star Wars started to suck. And as a kid, Return of the Jedi was my favorite of the original trilogy. But as I got older, I realized, you know what, this movie has some serious problems. The Ewoks do not tonally mesh with Star Wars at all. They feel like something from a kid's movie. Han Solo was totally underutilized and he felt useless in this movie, which was the same problem that Morpheus had in The Matrix Revolutions, which was in some ways a similar film to Return of the Jedi. Actually, Matrix Revolutions and Return of the Jedi are very similar in a lot of ways. But the thing is, people don't say Matrix Revolutions was a great movie. Most people say that it was kind of disappointing. I would agree. I'd say Matrix Revolutions was like a 6 out of 10, 6.5, and so was Return of the Jedi. They're pretty close together in quality. So they're not terrible movies, but like they're not great either. Another thing in Return of the Jedi, the entire plot with Jabba's palace, it ultimately, like, it was kind of fun. Like, it brought about a bunch of fun moments, but didn't really add anything to the story. And it's like, you could have removed it and the story overall would have been the same. And I've noticed that it was the first to do that. And now a lot of movies do that in the third installment in the trilogy, where they have this like first act side trip to go rescue the main character or one of the main characters. Like there was with Han Solo rescuing him from Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. Then it was rescuing Neo from the Merovingians' subway station owned by the Merovingian and the train man in Matrix Revolutions. And there was also rescuing Jack Sparrow from Davy Jones' locker in At World's End. And also, I think they went to Singapore beforehand for some reason. I don't even know why they went to Singapore. I don't even remember. But yeah, same sort of thing. It seems to be in third movies. Actually, the only one that did it, I think, pretty well was Revenge of the Sith. Kind of did it with the beginning scene where they were rescuing Palpatine from General Grievous, except that scene actually moved the plot forward. That's the difference. That scene was actually integral to the rest of the film and moved it forward. Unlike really the other aforementioned examples, which were kind of like, they produced some fun scenes and some fun moments, but ultimately they existed kind of in a bottle and weren't that relevant to the overall plot of the film. And you could have removed the entire thing and the overall plot of the trilogy and of the third film would be more or less the same. Like essentially it felt like filler. The first act side trip. The other problem was they literally repeated the entire plot from A New Hope of destroying the Death Star. Even back then, people thought that was ridiculous. And then they did it a third time in The Force Awakens, which was just absurd. Like, people actually groaned in the cinema out loud. Like, really loud. Like, the entire cinema fucking groaned as soon as they mentioned a new Death Star. People groaned in a way, it was almost like, were they laughing at the film or with it? Was it supposed to make you groan? Was that the intention? Like in The Force Awakens, it seems so on the nose, it's almost like they wanted you to have that reaction. I don't even fucking know. Did they want us to have that reaction with somehow Palpatine returned also? I don't know. That's another thing. Did Rise of Skywalker have a third act side trip? First act side trip in the third movie in the franchise, where they rescued someone? I've only seen that movie once and I don't even fucking remember it because it was such a piece of shit. So I don't even remember if that happened in Rise of Skywalker, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did, because it seems to be the thing with third movies in the franchise, in a trilogy. So yeah, those are some of the problems with Return of the Jedi, but people act like it was a flawless movie because my childhood, like, oh, you can't criticize the Star Wars original trilogy. Just like, oh, you can't criticize Back to the Future Part 3. Like, oh, these are from the pre-woke era, therefore they were good. It's like, no, there were bad movies back then too. There were mediocre movies. There were mixed bag movies. Yes, I mean, I would say movies overall were best in the 90s and 2000s. I thought the 2010s was actually a pretty good decade too. But I would agree, there has been a decline lately. Like, movies are getting worse on average. But at the same time, I wouldn't say they're getting worse in every way, because I think visuals and cinematography, atmosphere, they're often doing pretty well in. And it doesn't mean every movie's shit either, or that everything back then was good. Like, I think people do tend to idealize older stuff because of my childhood. And I think another example is how people, they notice wokeness. Like, okay, movies are definitely more woke on average today, but it doesn't mean there was no wokeness back then. Like, look at a movie like V for Vendetta. That movie was in your face woke. Could you imagine if it came out today, how much shit it would be getting for how woke it is? But I feel like a lot of the same people who shit on every movie today for being woke would look back at V for Vendetta and be like, oh, that was an amazing movie from the good old days, back when movies were good. It's like, no, that movie was fucking woke AF. Don't kid yourselves. That movie was in your face with its like radical left-wing messages. It was full to the brim with them. Do I even need to list examples? Like, I don't even think I need to list examples for V for Vendetta. Like, if you can't see how that movie was like super woke, then you're blind, frankly. And even like in other cases, there were more subtle examples of wokeness in casting, even in like the original, in the Matrix trilogy, Hunger Games, even to an extent, even in the original Star Wars trilogy. Like, the Empire were always composed of white human men, whereas the rebels, I mean, okay, in A New Hope, the rebels were overwhelmingly white human men, but then as it went on, like in Return of the Jedi, if you look at that rebel council scene, you have white men, you have white women, you have non-white men. I don't remember if there were any non-white women, but you also have plenty of aliens. So yes, it was, even in Return of the Jedi, it was kind of already framed as like diversity are the good guys, white men, white fascist men who behave like Nazis but have British accents and dressed like Nazis are the bad guys, but are also for some reason a metaphor for the United States in Vietnam. It's a bit confusing. But yes, okay, so those parallels existed even in the pre-woke era. Like the Matrix films, like the agents are all white men, every one of them. Whereas the good guys are a diverse mix. And Hunger Games, I don't remember entirely, but I'm pretty sure the capital people are overwhelmingly white. I mean, Donald Sutherland's character, Coriolanus, no, it's not Cornelius, it's like Coriolanus or some shit like that. Coriolanus Snow is like the whitest of the white. He's like so white that everything about him is white. He dresses in white, his hair is white, his face is white. His name is literally Snow. Like, he's just white, white, white. Same with the fucking architect in The Matrix Reloaded, the guy who's like in charge of the Matrix. He's like Mr. White. I think Neo even calls him "you old white prick" when he's like all the screens of the Neos screaming at him on his televisions. But yeah, I mean, again, I'm not trying to say these were bad movies. I love the Matrix films, like the original trilogy, especially the first two. But there were, and same with like New Hope and fucking Empire Strikes Back, great movies, you know. But these issues did exist back then. There was some wokeness in the casting. It was more subtle back then for sure. And today it's more in your face. Like if you look at like The Last Jedi, the wokeness in that movie was way more in your face. I will agree. Like Admiral Holdo, she literally looked like a gender studies teacher and she talked like one. Like she had that exact cadence, like the way she spoke, the tone in her voice, the words she used, and the inflections of how she spoke were exactly like a leftist university professor. Anybody who's ever gone to university would recognize the way she talks and the way she looks and her body language, everything about her. They would recognize that right away. It would give them like PTSD thinking back to like their days in university, like almost like a fucking Vietnam flashback. Like, oh, I remember the classes. It never ended. It never ended. All the fucking like isms and oh, the evil white men. Yeah, like it's literally like having flashbacks. But yeah, I get it. Like, movies have gotten probably more woke, but it's not like the wokeness didn't exist back then. They've gotten more woke on average, but at the same time, you still got the occasional movie back then like V for Vendetta that was hyper woke. V for Vendetta might even be more woke. Like, I can't think of like a major blockbuster film in the last 5 or 10 years that was more overtly woke than V for Vendetta. Maybe I'm wrong. The original Avatar film, that was 2009. I don't know. Is that the before times or is that the current today times? I don't know. But that was pretty in your face woke also. I guess Last Jedi was up there for most in your face woke. But I'd still say V for Vendetta probably beats it. It's close, but V for Vendetta is more overtly political. But yeah, the next thing I wanted to say is that, okay, my biggest problem with people idealizing these past eras is it's not even about, like, if you want to think the movies and TV shows were better, fine. I think that they were better on average too. It's just I think it's a little bit more nuanced. However, here's what I'm going to say. Don't fall into the trap of fucking idealizing everything about those eras. Because honestly, like the 50s, 60s, that was 70s, that was like the peak era of like destroying historic architecture and of modernist everything. Like just destroying we must destroy all the historic architecture, replace it with ugly modernist shit. And like, okay, you want to talk about when America was the most crime ridden? I mean, technically speaking, the crime rates were like super high between like the late 60s and like mid 90s. So again, were those the good old days in that regard? I don't know. And it was just the height of like fucking mall culture and just like people like Main Street being abandoned and replaced by the mall and like suburban endless sprawl and car culture. Like, I don't know. Those decades weren't that great. I mean, I guess it depends which decades you're talking about because the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s were kind of like the renaissance of when the cities started to be kind of revitalized again. And now, sadly, they're starting to go to shit again ever since 2020 when the year when certain events happened and changed the course of history and for the most part, not for the better. Like, I'd say like 90% for the worse. But yeah, I mean, we just shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking everything was better back then. Like, not only media, but like every aspect of society. Like, yeah, things were better in some ways. Like, your chance of a marriage not ending in divorce was probably higher back then. Things were less overtly woke. There was less open hatred against white men and white people in general. But still, demographically, things were better. I mean, things were better in a lot of ways. There was less fucking forest fire smoke. Global warming was less bad. Although most of the people who have this narrative don't believe in global warming. But I'm just saying it was less bad back then. Like, overall, things were less bad in a lot of ways. But, I mean, let's not fall into the trap of thinking everything was good back then. Like, do you remember how fucking slow the internet was in, like, the 90s and the 2000s? And how often computers would just glitch and freeze and just behave like total pieces of shit, and just how slow and shitty everything was. I remember. But yeah. Anyway, that's my point on all that. So yeah, that's my rant ending now.